I don't want to set the world on fire. I just want to start a flame in your heart. I don't want to set the world on fire. I just want to start a flame in your heart.
Just in following up on that last note, we were discussing just briefly about, modern medicine and the way that it may misunderstand people, or the way it may promote a misunderstanding of itself. And one thing that comes out of that, of course, is the power of placebo. And it's statistically relevant and well-studied, positive benefits for healing. And Darren, you also mentioned the healing in Greece, the nature of healing the mind, and there's another direction that I think is really interesting, is just to me, what has become really clear is the way modern humans live, in thousands of different aspects, is just directly anti-life and anti-health. It's I don't think it's like very edgy to say that people live in the way that they've been inculcated to live, and that manifests these physical ailments that they sense, and they go to the doctor to get a Band-Aid that numbs them to the ailment, so they, more or less can continue living in the strongly, antisocial, irrational ways. And so among the catalog of, better cures is not only placebo and kind of curing the understanding of the illness, but also, curing the mind of the mental habits and, quote unquote, facts that generate the dysregulation of the body or life that causes the illness. But I don't know if that's, I wanted to tack that on, but I don't know if that stirs anything.
Yeah, I want to hear more about your thoughts regarding dentistry, if anything comes to mind. Because, yeah, I feel the same way. So, I want to hear your thoughts.
Oh, it's I don't know, quite an eye opener. To me, it was, to me anyway. And the trick is, I kind of feel like you asked that question in such a great way. There's so many directions that could go. So let me just take a second and go quickly and develop the depth, So before the recording began, I kind of mentioned my, one of my examples in history of dentistry, and it was just an infected tooth in the cavity, and just the whole idea, the recognition that these cavities that I got when I was younger, I didn't recognize it was a subscription service. Every 10 years or so, they're going to have to go in there and pull the thing out, or put in a new one, or I didn't, I thought that they were curing me, not that they were drilling a massive hole in me and in my mouth, and then packing it in a way that would have to be attended to over and over. So it was really interesting. And then I learned also, many dentists will say, it doesn't really matter what you brush your teeth with. You can use any kind of paste or whatever you like. Of course, there are recommended ones, and there are ones with fluoride, and that's interesting. But, it doesn't matter so much. And then I, went to school and learned a lot about biochemistry. And you learn about the absorption of minerals, about the importance of ion transfer and ion adsorption. Things like the way the cells of the body send electrical signals or open channels and transfer nutrients. Of course, this is all just normative science, right? But like, there's some really interesting stuff here. Given my really terrible experience with dentistry, I mean, my teeth are fine. They're great these days. But I then kind of continued to learn more. I learned about oil pulling in India. And I learned about how things like coconut water has been used as blood transfusions in the past because it so nearly matches the pH and some of the vital chemistry of blood plasma. And so, this was really interesting to me. And, to then look at a tradition in India and Ayurveda where dental health was maintained through oil pulling. And oil pulling, you swish coconut oil in your mouth, and there's a whole protocol. You have to do it 100 times, swishing this way, and whatever. And what seemed really clear to me at that point, anyway, and I maintain this, is that the facts obscure the truth off to both sides. There's this narrow way in which the dentists want to take drills into your mouth. And on the other hand, in oil pulling, there's a strange protocol that's almost like religious or devotional. And that's kind of funny. But the fact is that I had heard, of course, that it doesn't matter what you brush your teeth with. And your mouth maintains a whole microbiota that supports your dental health. Of course, fluoride and other petrochemicals are going to diminish or destroy that. And so I had also heard about oil pulling and the natural, the way that coconut oil and its properties can kind of match with your body and adhere to your teeth in particular ways, was really interesting to me. So I started making my own toothpaste. I started making it with a couple of essential oils known for dental health and with coconut oil. And holy shit, it just seems to work. Don't have any problems. And it is really excellent to me, Now, that's just one of three things. So I'll quickly get to the next ones. One thing that became really clear is that in using oil in your mouth in dental health, it's interesting that, if you think about what we ingest in terms of energy, we ingest sugars and we ingest starches and we ingest oils. These are, oils and fats. These are the three major sources of energy for the human body, and your body handles them differently. And that's important. It's very important. What's really interesting is that, fats and oils are the highest density of energy, but they're kind of the hardest to access. Where sugars, your body just dumps it straight into your bloodstream. But we've talked a lot about how Aboriginal societies went from a high nutrient plant and very clean animal proteins and fats for their diet, and transitioned into a grain-based diet, which is based on consuming starches.
Right.
And what's really interesting, you just look at the archaeological record, the way people's teeth fell apart. Now, beyond that, of course, we have moved into the realm of sugar, an additive that has not, been in human diets, not substantially beyond maybe 100 years. And of course, people's teeth are just rotting out of their heads. And so, there's an obvious correlation there where the starches that fuel the kind of microbiota and bacteria that dissolve your teeth that's the foundation of everyone's diet. The other thing that became really apparent to me is when I tried to quit sugar, I felt like I was quitting heroin or something. It was kind of amazing. I kind of have an on and off relationship with sugar, and it's really interesting to me to note how it affects my body, how I feel when I've had sugar recently, or when it's been a week or so since I've last had any sugar. I notice the quality of my mind changing, the clarity of my ability to think, and I noticed my dental, just the feel of my mouth was vastly different. And combined with, kind of a thermodynamic understanding of metabolizing these energy sources, when I went away from starches from time to time, which I tend to do in like kind of an intermittent fasting way. I'm not a big nerd about this, but the key thing is how much of a difference I've felt and experienced through all these things. We have talked about the kind of behaviors and emotions and proclivities that a society raised on bread exhibits, and I understand how the biochemistry of that process can do things like impact people's moods and their aggression or their senses of joy and peace. I've felt it even in my own body, In fact, last night I binged a little bit on these oatmeal cookies, which don't have a ton of sugar, but I had kind of a violent dream. It's really strange. And I'm not saying that's causation, but the correlations, just continue to kind of stack up for me. And that's really interesting or weird. But the last thing I'll just say real quick is we've talked a lot about, and this is a topic that I love and, I think maybe we'll explore again soon, but is the way that desire loops, the way that our thirst for something can create a feedback loop, which emerges a program or an institution or a way, an understanding that takes control of us, which is interesting. And I see dentistry in the same way. We have this society which, is wholesale bent on wrecking all sorts of things, but even our own health, and particularly in this case, our teeth, right? Our dental health. And it's fascinating to see, the dynamics of an industry. You can see this in therapy. You can see this in medicine all over the place, But you can see that the interventions are good enough for a time. The understandings are just wrong enough that it gets you coming back. So those are just a few things that come to mind with your question, But it's I love the question. Curious what you're thinking or where anyone wants to take it.
Well, isn't fluoride some kind of industrial waste product? Isn't it created through like fertilizer production and then it's resold in another market? I find
they get you coming and going.
Sorry.
Yeah, what is the it's kind of surprising. I'm in one of the few places in the country that doesn't fluoridate its water. And just given my experience with what I learned or whatever with not only biology, biochemistry, but also with environmental toxins, environmental pollution. Wow. No institution gives a crap about the health of Americans. It's really breathtaking, given the state of water supplies in the across America today. People don't even recognize the tip of the iceberg about how dangerous even just drinking water is, But then you do something and add a low-level fluoride, a light neurotoxin. And I don't know. I wouldn't pretend to have studies on how this impacts our neurology or our overall health or our day-to-day, clarity and cognition. But I have a, just kind of like, from my training in science, just kind of a way that I kind of want my water to be handled. And I notice when I travel, even drinking chlorinated water now really upsets my gut. It really bothers me, and I can't do it. Can't do it for more than 2 or 3 days. And that difference just in, the tap water from some other place versus the water that I filter myself, really kind of impresses me about how fucked up, the system is and how it makes our health.
Now, would you be willing to share your toothpaste formula with us?
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. It's a piece of cake.
That's cool.
You just take coconut oil. It's pseudo solid. It melts it kind of like, just above room temperatures. And the essential oils, let me see if I can recall them. Clove oil is great. I just kind of ballpark it. I take, I don't know, maybe a quarter cup of coconut oil and get it just kind of warm so it's a little liquid. And drop in probably to that level about 15 or 20 drops of clove oil, maybe 5 or 10 drops of peppermint oil, and a little bit of tea tree oil if I feel like it. And you can have toothpicks that are used in the same way or coated in the same way that I really enjoy. This is really nice. But I'm reminded, I forget the name, but there's a culture in Africa that use a certain stick. You kind of chew on the end of the stick, and the bark is basic in pH, which helps things like calcium adhere to your teeth and promotes a good mouth microbiome. I think that's really fascinating. I forget the name of the stick or the culture that uses this, but that's an interesting look into. I should probably research more. But anyways, that's my toothpaste formula. Oh, the last thing, sorry, the coconut oil, those essential oils, and I add some baking soda as well. That's it. Basically all to taste.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, I take that kind of as just a window. There's if there are problems on that front, of course there are problems on many other fronts, many other interesting, situations. Have you seen research about knee surgeries or other surgical interventions and the placebo effect?
Yeah, there was one book on this which I can find for you. But yeah, he basically argues that knee surgery is entirely a placebo effect of some kind. So you can wash the knee without doing anything, and the same effects result. So yeah, it's really fascinating. I'll find the book.
There's a document on my Medium channel called Notes from Beyond, and there's a video. It's a gigantic document, but there's a video in that document about the placebo effect that's quite good and is available online. And I think it discusses, unless I'm misremembering, I think it discusses knee surgery particularly.
Oh yeah, it's called Surgery: The Ultimate Placebo by Ian Harris. You can check that out.
I think it would be a mistake, though I'm not trying to tell anyone what to think. But I think it would be a mistake to dismiss allopathic medicine.
Agreed.
It should be blatantly obvious. that there are many situations in which allopathic medicine and allopathic dentistry work as advertised, function, save lives that would otherwise almost certainly be lost. But there's a kind of a weirder question in the background here, I think, which is, rather than trying to determine which thing humans do is truthful or veritable, right? Like, is what the Greeks were doing in Alephsis the right way to heal humans, or is the hospital the right way to heal humans? There's something much weirder going on, which is a kind of a sort of surreptitious hypnosis. And when I began to study hypnosis, perhaps, 10 years ago now or something, I strongly recommend anybody even vaguely interested, get like, I have this book here that's quite a big tome and it's astonishing. It's called Ericksonian Approaches, a Comprehensive Manual. Formal hypnosis is relatively straightforward. There's a client, there's a practitioner. You sit the client down, you place them in trance. They place themselves in trance at your behest, however you want to model it. But what I'm trying to get at here, which is kind of weird, is that it's like our cultures are a universe, and our body responds to that universe according to the instructions it's been given. So we might have the idea of the placebo effect backwards, right? It's not the placebo effect. It's this other thing that nobody's really looking at, or few people look at. I think Robert Anton Wilson talks about this kind of thing. Yeah, it's more like our existence is a kind of a trance. And when you study hypnosis, you immediately realize that people are hypnotized all the time, pretty much all the time. They rarely come out of it. So all you're really doing is redirecting the form and the flow of what's already going on. Does that make any sense?
I think so. I think I follow. And I'm curious about the reversal, I guess. I have to think about those words better.
So I'll try to give an example, which I found startling, even though, I have some experience with hypnosis, not a modest amount, but also I'm not an expert. I was having someone deliver groceries. They had an accident on the way on their skateboard and were, in a lot of pain. And the person was a very tough guy. He'd been in prison, been through a lot of fights and stuff. And it was clear he was in a lot of pain. And he was also pissed off. And he was partly pissed at me. And over a period of about 4 minutes, basically I just said, look, I can make that pain go away. It's like, I don't have time for this. And I said, do you have 3 minutes? It was like, what do you mean? I said, just sit down, I'll make it go away. Okay. So he sat down, I quickly put him in trance. I gave him like 2 very basic suggestions. I just said, like, I'm going to touch your knee. When I do that, you're going to forget all about the pain. You won't be able to feel it unless you need to feel it for your safety. It's just going to go away. And so when I pull my finger off your knee, you're going to feel all that pain just disappear. That's all I said. I woke him up, and he was a completely different person. He was like, what the fuck did you do? I feel amazing. There's no pain at all, right? And you can imagine that this is just, post-trance euphoria or whatever. But what I told him was, I I want you to check in with me over the next few days. And if the pain comes back at all, call me. And I'll call you and check in on you and just see what's going on. And I checked in on him a couple days later, and I was like, did you ever feel the pain again? He's like, no, not at all. It's gone. So what is pain? Right? What the fuck is going on there? There are much deeper questions than whether or not our medical approaches are sound. We may have misunderstood the fundamental situation of like being alive in such a way that leads to a variety of kind of reality tunnels, which our body obeys as if we're undergoing hypnotic suggestion. What is the actual nature of illness and injury? Right? There is a mechanical aspect to it, yes. I think the Greeks were well aware of all of these matters in different ways. I don't know what their awareness was like, and I also mean certain Greeks. But I think what they realized was that what was really necessary for healing was a revision of the trance state that those who are sick or injured have become enmeshed in. I could give examples from my own experience, but that would be a little personal. So yeah, I think it's useful to question allopathic medicine and the way that medicine is handled in modernity, for sure. No problem. I agree. A lot of that stuff is crazy. And some of it's very functional. But if we really want to understand what's going on, I think we need to understand something much deeper, which is like, are any of the myths that we live by veritable? Including, for example, the alternate myths. When somebody commits to a practice like oil pulling, what are they really doing? Well, they're changing their understanding of what the body is, and they're instructing the body to respond through a practice that is reiterated over time. Now, I'm not trying to claim that there's no efficacy in the practice. There's like no mechanical efficacy there. That's not my claim. So I'm going to leave it here and see what other people may have to think or say about it.
Well, part of it could be the reaction to the pain itself. So if I say hit my knee on a dolly, those things when people move really heavy objects with, that really hurts. But in my mind, I don't immediately catastrophize about it. I sort of have a method of how I deal with it. I just put my palm on the place where it hurts and I rub in a circle. And gradually it goes away. Sometimes it takes a little longer. And a couple nights ago, no, like 4 nights ago, I was in the enclosure with Patches, and she was acting a little distressed. And she was standing next to me, so she'd pace the fence line and then come back and stand next to me. And I found where her heartbeat was, and I did that. And eventually she sat down, and then she started falling asleep.
So did you physically touch her?
Yes, I was basically hugging her. Yeah, I was hugging her, and I was rubbing in a circular motion over her heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you when you mention the example about the dolly and pain, I'm just reminded of there was an account I read of a early explorer discussing Native Americans, and they noted, and I thought this was odd, it stood out to me, that they rarely cry out when struck or wounded. And that fascinated me, just as an observation from a colonial person. So, what's interesting, the direction that we're applying here, I think, is fascinating in the sense that, just to describe where we're coming from, and then I am excited to go where you're indicating, Darren, where we're coming from this, this place of cultural or knowledge resonance you know, where there are these feedback loops that create these ideas, that train us with these reactions, that instill these beliefs that, you know, they're really interesting, that, you know, and some, not entirely, you know, not, you know, cases matter and particulars are important, but they're getting people to think of their bodies in this way. They're getting people to think of illness in this way, and they're getting people to think of cures in this way. You know, like we might be implying, like forgetting what we actually are. You know, the idea of the body being a projection of a different underlying reality that's kind of constructed in real time. I think along your text recently, Tyler, right? Like this is really fascinating. It reminds me of this guy, Joe Dispenza. He's doing a thing right now. Now, I have some friends that are really into Joe Dispenza, so I've been checking it out a bit. You know, this long history, I mean, there's the Greek healing traditions. There's, you know, I've read all sorts of stuff about, you know, gynecologists and other sorts of people like doing all, you know, breaking chicken bones and of course, the shamanic rituals of healing that, I mean, we would probably, you know, this culture would be tempted to label that placebo, but there's something interesting going on. So with these friends, I'm not really motivated by health. I think it's just not a problem for me. But a lot of my friends who are really into Joe Dispenza are very motivated by their own ailments, you know, and there's some serious ailments. And it's really interesting from the outside looking at this. Lots of these people are saying that they've been faith healed or miraculously cured, you know, in interesting ways. And so I've started to study what Dispenza's doing a bit. And what he's doing is rooted in this belief, you know, in a set of beliefs, not particularly clear, right, which is reasonable, about quantum physics and materiality and the nature of the body. But anyway, he has all these people stuck in these loops and they have ailments. You know, no doubt many of them are, you know, mechanical in nature, but one of his recent books goes into a long example about a woman who, you know, developed chronic stress and then all of these, you know, physical manifestations as a result of that just were absolutely piling on and ruining her life. So he's doing this thing, you know, initially probably through books, I think, which induce a sort of trance state or change it. And trying to get people to understand their bodies and lived experiences differently. And then people are going to these retreats where, you know, for a week or whatever, there are 800 people and together they meditate. And together they speak, and together they kind of re-envision their bodies being whole and healthy in a resonant way. And I haven't done any of this, you know, with Joe Dispenza and all this stuff, but what's fascinating is the number of people who do say they are somehow healed from this. And I don't know if that reimagining of reality stirs up, you know, again, more conversation about this, but there, you know, there's a movement afoot in the United States doing this, and that's interesting. So for what it's worth.
So there's some things that are apparent to me, considering what we were just sharing, Cornfed. And one of them that I think is really important, and it's something that in a, you know, in a kind of a limited way we do here, is that so one of the things Toymaker said was that there are a couple of pivots of human power, and most people are not aware of them. Two that come to mind immediately that he pointed out to me was to be aware to forge a layer of your awareness that observes the purposes underlying your actions and your inactions, including speech. And then to be able to expand that to look at the purposes underlying the actions and inactions of human groups. That's one of them. This practice or game, play, is extremely powerful because we normally don't, like if you watch someone speaking and you're face to face with them, if you're sensitive to the language of their facial expressions, you will immediately see that there's a difference between their purpose and what they're saying. And there's a difference between what they're saying and what they mean. And these differences are quite profound. So often people will communicate one thing with their face and a completely different thing, or even a conflicted thing, right? Something that conflicts with what they're feeling with their speech. So the first thing is purpose, but the second thing is agreement. Basically what he said is that one of the primary powers you have as a human being that is almost completely overlooked is your capacity to agree, in other words, to authorize something, and your capacity to defect from agreement. You don't have to disagree. You can simply hold the space of what? Not knowing, or, there's a lot of options for the not agreeing part. The reason I mention this is that it should be very obvious that if Joe Dispenza gets 800 people together whom he has instructed in a paradigmatic ontology of health and healing, and these 800 or even 20, right? These people, they agree about this together. What they are doing, one of the things they can be understood to be doing, is they are reforging the ontology in which they enter trance together, right? They're reforging the basis of their group hypnosis into a mode that differs from the group hypnosis they are participating in and subject to outside of Joe, like in our culture or whatever. Again, this from a sort of helicopter view, right? From a view above the human view, it looks like the humans establish what we could call nations of hypnotic proposal, right? And what are the proposals? Well, the proposals are what you are, who you are, what it means to be human, what it means to be an animal, what the sky is, what the sun is, what the world is, what food means, what injury means, what illness means, all of these things. So there's this invisible kind of semi or acutely hypnotic lexicon that underlies how we feel, what we make of experience, how we relate with illness or injury. I mean, you can imagine a people, right, who simply believe, we can invent ontologies like Joe's, right? Imagine a people who simply believe that injury or illness in any human being, or even an animal, is absolutely holy. There's nothing wrong with it at all. It's not there to be cured. It's not even there to be fixed. What it is that person is taking on the toxicity and pain and perhaps, demons, whatever, that would otherwise infect the whole group, and they're just localizing it in a way that is messianic.
Well, no, I mean, that was the traditional understanding.
Sure. Right.
Well, yeah.
Well, sure. Yeah, fair enough. All I'm trying to get at is, it's the unconsciously held hypnotic ontologies that humans learn to relate with themselves as me too, right? Like I can see these things. It doesn't liberate me from them just to see them. I'm not sure what does liberate me from them particularly, but seeing them is helpful. And weirdly, you know, there's been a pretty significant decrease in the pain in my neck as we've been talking.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And I had some healers working on me, and they were like, you know, as far as we can tell, you're dead set against healing. Like, we're not able to heal you because you've decided not to heal. And that was, you know, interesting. There are certainly psychological aspects to injury. It might be that most of the aspects are psychological, but of course, I think we would recognize that things like a cavity in a tooth, or a bone that is broken, or, you know, other significant mechanical problems, including certain, you know, illnesses of organs and so forth, are not merely psychological.
Yeah.
The cohorts of ontology and affect, you know, that you described, you know, beautifully put. I kind of wonder, you know, and this is, George, you might recognize this content. I'm curious if you have reactions, but of course anyone else too. But it's interesting in our waking perception, we have this opportunity, you know, to navigate what is apparently the material world and effect it with our will. And it's notable that in the waking world, you know, we can use our same will, our same understanding in a symmetrical way to navigate our minds and effect their contents and their structures. You know, in a dreaming world, we have this ability to navigate the interiority of the contents of our psyche, whatever that is. God only knows, you know? And I wonder why we wouldn't correspondingly or somehow symmetrically, you know, maybe in a way I don't understand yet, have the ability to navigate the interiority of our bodies and affect it with our will.
Well, yesterday I mentioned that language is a controlled hallucination. So I wonder, Darren, whether you see a connection between what I said yesterday and your understanding of hypnosis. What do you see there, if anything?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes. Very clearly, of course, I do. So it's as if I often find it useful to think of awareness, much like reality, as comprised of layers. And the representational layer, which is the layer in which we think, feel, or experience according to the underlying lexicons, like what stuff is, what the world is. You know, there are these root features that if you change them, like the world, if you change what the world is, all other things change. That should be obvious. And the humans keep introducing these essentially technological ontologies from physics and so forth. And I personally, I find it sort of silly and tragic, but not merely that. There are interesting features as well. When humans use wildly crude, they transfer, actually what they do is they grab authority from science to support some personal ontology or religion. And they're like, oh yeah, it's quantum physics, bro. Yeah, it's all just in the superposition. And you collapse it with your, da-dee-da, right? I'm like, okay, your understanding of quantum physics is basically nil. Because it has nothing to do with what quantum physics is, says, or does. So I find that kind of tragic and stupidifying, while still remaining open at the same time. I don't like it. I realize that's one of my biases, too. But yeah, so there's this underlying trance, and the trance, this is what Korzybski, right, was fundamentally trying desperately to communicate in his profoundly over-articulate manner. There's a trance, right? And the trance orbits one specific feature of representational cognition, and that feature is identity. What is it? And this is what the ontologies are there to answer. They tell us what it is. So even the idea of injury, right? Is it actually something specific? Is it a thing? It's very complicated. The person next to me is alive and experiencing reality. They are not experiencing my injury. So where is my injury? So yeah, I think language induces trance in the representational layer, which profoundly connects itself and influences other layers, whatever those may be. And that's problematical. Korzybski outlined a discipline to escape that trance, which he calls non-Aristotelian logic, or null A, the basic proposal of which is the refusal to assert identity under any circumstance, in a variety of other corollary disciplines. For example, the concept of non-allness. You will find humans consistently, myself included, will make declarations that appear perfectly complete, right? I lost $100 at the casino. Right? It's presented as a complete fact. And Korzybski discovered that this single-valued ontology is basically a machine for self-deception. It proposes that we know completely what an event or situation is, was, does, its value, so forth. That is formally impossible. There is nothing about which that can be true. So there are a variety of habitual deceptions underlying not necessarily language itself, but how we as moderns employ it. And those can be discovered and overcome.
Yeah. Well, the narrative buttresses selfhood. So when you talk about identity, I immediately think of selfhood, the concept of the self, as opposed to substances or what other beings are. But there's a link between them. So you realize that in developing ontologies of objects, you really end up self-narratizing So
Mhm.
by rendering your ontology more plastic, you're basically making your ego more plastic, and that seems to be the portal. That seems to be um, the deeper problem. So yeah, I think language itself is something like an externalized dream mechanism, and that's why I said that it's a controlled form of hallucination. Because if dreams arise when perception inverts, um, relying purely on the body's morphology, its internal temporal structure, then hallucinations arise when this inversion is incompletely um, reintegrated into the image of the external world. So psychosis would be something like the destabilization of symbolic time, but there's a link between symbolism or your lexicon and your sense of self. So there's a link between the language that you use and your own identity. Um,
I think that non-ordinary states, such as psychosis or whatever, depend largely on some other features that it's at least important to mention. Um, so, like, there's a. Okay, stop using filler words. Uh, no, not. All right. So, let's see. We can posit two very similar states, or not states, but situations in consciousness or awareness. And we'll call one psychosis. We'll call the other one prodigious creativity. So these states they have a lot of things in common. These situations have a lot of things in common. But there's something resembling the character, the purposive character and orientation underlying the state. And that's where I would differentiate between psychosis and, say, a moment of an actual experience in which prodigious creativity is at play without it endangering the coherence of the self. So in psychosis, like in creativity, what happens is the self we could imagine, expresses into a space of possibility. Whereas in psychosis, it seems more as if, usually, realizing that psychosis is a continuum of many different things, that the polarity is inverted. And so the self becomes subject to usually deleterious, threatening, formidable, malignant, malevolent intrusions of exotic mind forms. So one seems to be expressive and the other is impressive in this toy that I'm just trying to put together to differentiate. Genius is a lot like experiences of genius, not just this guy's genius. The experience and the activities of a prodigy, and I think we are each here prodigies in our own ways, though George's prodigy seems rather monumental in my view. These experiences of prodigy have to do with directing the formative flow of awareness or consciousness in specific ways that lead to highly novel insights or activities or experiences. I'm not sure if any of that was useful. I'm going to stop blathering now.
no, yeah, I mean, but yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me because you can make sense of how the mind could heal the body if the link between the dream and the hallucination is based on something like what you're describing. So in the dream world, the imagery arises from the temporal structure of the body as a template. So this is the inversion of the usual process that takes place in perception. But the hallucination then is the exteriorization of that process. So it's so there would be some kind of link between the psychotic state inaugurated by Krzyzewski's general semantics and healing, which I think is what you're getting at. At least as far as my toy goes.
Yes. There is this weird polar inversion that occurs in the difference between waking world stuff and sleeping world stuff. And it's like in the waking world, there is the continuous fact of the existence and pervasiveness of sunlight. Often you can actually see the sun, though few of us rarely look at it. And so there's this exteriorization, right, of the sun. But in the sleeping world, this is one of the reasons why I love this question. What is the source of illumination in dreams? In the sleeping world, the fact of the exterior sun is gone. It is gone. You know, you can say, well, it's just on the other side of the world. Or, okay, yeah, fine, but it's gone. Your explanation doesn't matter because the thing ain't there, right? Now, it may be there in the memory. This is what really triply associates the moon with memory, right? Because moonlight is the memory of sunlight in a way. It is the ghost of sunlight. So in the dream, what happens is resembles the rising of an internal sun. What is that? What is that? It's not the sun. Though, of course, it couldn't exist without it, theoretically. So there's this reverse polarization that occurs where the external sun and the externality of light becomes the internal illuminator, and the internality of light form meaning. And it's just this one transition in our experience is so astonishing and so profoundly fraught with the possibilities of insight. It's mysterious. I don't have the answer, but I just marvel at it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, cognition doesn't arise from sensory input either.
Yeah. What that shit arises from, I would love to know.
Well, yeah, but I think the same process is probably at work either way. So what arises as light in the external world is similar to what arises in the dream environment. Because either way, there are temporal layers, something like temporal layers, something like retrieval keys or gateways, but their manner of arising is inverted. There's a kind of inversion, and the body punctuates that inversion. So you can reconstruct light either way, and this is why I said that space can arise in either direction, either by moving out or by moving in. And so this is the sense in which space is downstream from what I'm calling time. So time is more fundamental than space, in my view, for that reason, because you can engender space from time in either direction. So in one direction, you perceive this consensus reality, and in the other direction, you perceive a dream environment which is reassembled from the temporal structure of your own morphology. So your body becomes a world-generating mechanism in the dream environment. But both sources of light have a similar kind of process of arising because they take place through these layers that become more compact as the organism evolves. So we were talking about like the density of these retrieval keys in the body of an animal. It's that density that gives rise to the perception of light, I think, within the dream landscape. And because the same mechanism underpins cognition, it's what cognition is. It's the same thing.
So there's something really important here. One particular phrase that you used a moment ago. In sleep, something is generating worlds, and we experience them. I don't know. I don't even know what's experiencing them, to be honest. I don't know. But we have experience of them, that which we can later sometimes recall. The proposition of the Castaneda branch of shamanism and the Toltecs and the Aztecs and the South American branches, and probably almost certainly, obviously, other branches as well, is that we're doing the same thing while we're awake. We are generating a world image. The mode is different. In dreaming, we can become lucid and realize that somehow we are the origin of the world images, although we don't usually have that particular realization. Mostly it looks something like, oh, wait, this is a dream. And if that doesn't just wake you up, then you start to become lucid with all kinds, with a vast continuum
right.
of possible effects. But what would be the corollary in waking consciousness? It would be the same thing.
Yeah.
It's just much less likely because of the physical continuity and convincingness over time, right? See, in the dream, the world dissolves when you wake up, and it usually doesn't reemerge in the same way again later. You usually don't remember, like, oh yeah, I dreamed this before, and etc. Though that does sometimes happen. But the incredible fact of the physical continuity, right? My doorway is never not there when I wake up, is so convincing that we're unlikely to ever come to the understanding in actual awareness that I am generating this. It seems inconceivable, especially to the modes of thought and relation that are common while we're awake. They are antipathetic to that recognition. But this was the absolute assertion of the shamans, and they had this thing, which I think is the corollary of lucid dreaming, that they called stopping the world. And they didn't mean you put an end, you cause the world to stop spinning or something like that. They meant ceasing to use the energies of awareness to preserve the appearance of an illusion that you think of as the reliable, continuous physical waking world, and the identities, the ontologies associated with that.
Right. So we think it's the world that's stable, but it's really your own sense of self that gives the world its sense of stability. I guess that's what I was initially trying to get at when I spoke of selfhood and personhood. It's the ego that gives the world structure, and it's symbolically mediated. It's mediated by language. So language functions like the body itself because it allows the image of the external world to remain more or less stable. So in the dream environment, the world can collapse when you become a center of action. So usually you experience that as realizing that you're in a dream or something. But really what I think takes place is that your body starts to become more like a center of action as in the external world. So that's why the image collapses. But the same process can take place in waking consciousness. But it looks more like it's very similar because your focus is turned inward. It starts to become more action oriented, right? And that's what causes it can induce a psychotic break because language is no longer providing the stability that it once did. Your ego starts to evaporate. It's like waking up from a dream.
It's a sort of inversion from the other world.
Right. Because mostly what we perceive in external space are action-dependent affordances. So we perceive possibilities in external space, possibilities of action, with our own bodies as centers of action.
Yeah, what's interesting about this is that I might worry that the idea that we wake up to the world and it bears a steadiness that was the same as the last time we woke up to this world. There, it seems to induce a dualism there. The sense that the world I woke up to today, the material world, perhaps it's, and I don't know, but perhaps it's not material because it exists outside of me, but it is the world that I ordered and structured and constructed yesterday, imbued with identities and designations yesterday. The way that I wake up to the world today, it's the creation of my yesterdays. I wonder if there's, again, an inverse symmetry to plunging into the non-centered reality of the dream, structured, organized by the body in that way, or somehow by the memory, I don't know, for what it's worth. I think that we are building this world around us, not in a material way, but in an experiential way. And that's the experience we wake up to each day. But perhaps there's difference there. I'm curious.
Oh, no. So, yeah, where does the dualism enter for you?
Well, there's a sense that the world exists beyond me, beyond my experience, that the normative sense is that I wake up each day to this world that was as it was before, right? But the trick there is that it ignores the fact that I structured it through my actions in the previous time. Like I am molding the physical world, the quote unquote physical world around me and my experience of it and the experiences I carry forward from it in my everyday moment of waking life.
Yeah.
It's one thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's you.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
Of
so
course,
when you realize that it's you, yeah, I think that's that's the analogy to the dream environment. So in the dream environment, it's like, oh, this is a dream. But in the external world, it's like, oh, this is me. There's no distinction. And that's usually what I call knowledge. Like that's what like a cognitive act is in my view. But that's another matter. Yeah, but either way, the morphology of the body is structuring it or continuous with it. So what we call our bodies are fundamentally the same process as external space. So that's the sense in which it's you. There's no real difference. So in the same way that you could reconstruct your entire body and evolutionary history from any region of your body, any region of space contains enough information to reconstruct the entire universe. So there's no real distinction between you and the external world.
Yeah, just to take that further still, in just to continue to banish, to try to chase out the dualism or whatever, and I hope this isn't restating anything, but it seemed, something I read about psychiatry really fascinated me. As people get deeper into psychiatry and as they work with more and more people, they start to understand that, of course, the label, the identity, the concept of sanity itself is very slippery. It's extremely, subjective at best.
Right.
So what is our consciousness? Is it a logic that reflects the effected material world beyond us? Well, no, you know. This sets the table for the thing that you've often said, George, which is that our experience of the external world is a menu of affordances offered to us. You know, an opportunity space from which to explore and enact, right? It's a series of relationships with, you know, and space itself is the, you know, the opportunity to affect that affordance, right?
Yeah.
And so the material world is only the sum, well, at least for me, if not all beings, you know, it is the sum of the affordances we've chosen to affect.
Yes, right.
It presents itself the next day as the result, you know.
Right. So the image of the external world is already the effect of selection, is already a creative product. So what we call psychism isn't actually anomalous. It's what we're already doing. So I think the placebo effect reveals that we're already doing this. It just depends on certain constraints. So there seems to be something that impedes our ability to affect initially our own morphology, but then the external world. And that filter or lens has something to do with language. I'm becoming more convinced of that. And that's why the whole discussion of hypnosis was of interest to me. Because hypnosis simply unlocks the same process that we already participate in through our active, engagement with and construction or reconstruction of reality. So there's, yeah.
You know,
Like,
maybe it's not time, but there's a piece on tools that I want to chase down in that direction too, at some point.
right. If anything, modern medicine is the anomaly, um, whereas the placebo effect is probably ancient knowledge and well established.
I doubt they'd have called it anything like that. That phrase, we should pick a different phrase, because that phrase it carries derogatory connotations.
Yeah, the content has been slain.
Right. It's like it's a phrase from the clinical evaluative aspect of thought and linguistic conception and so forth, right? So I mistrust. But we all know what we mean. Well, we know what we're pointing at with the phrase. But I would just suggest that the phrase is quite compromised. For example, what is actually meant by the placebo effect is something like inexplicable healing. And if any kind of healing is explicable, I would love to see it.
Yeah.
In fact, anyone who thinks they can explain anything, I'd be very interested in that. This whole explanation thing is pretty weird.
Well, then wouldn't the placebo effect be the perfect term?
Say more.
Well,
For
if
the
the
will?
placebo is an inexplicable healing, then if you're saying that healing is inexplicable, then wouldn't placebo be the perfect term?
Well, let's find out what this word placebo.
Maybe magic would be better.
Right.
No, I just think something like I don't even know. What is this word? I don't even know what the word means. Oh, that's interesting. From the Latin placere, to please, to the Latin placebo, I shall be acceptable or pleasing. This is a great sense of the word. A substance that has no therapeutic effect. Which substance is that?
And yet somehow yields therapy.
Right. Let's look at the etymology. This is very interesting. Early 13th century, name given to the rite of Vespers by the Office of the Dead, so called from the opening of the first antiphon, I will please the Lord in the land of the living. Psalm CXVI 9 in Vulgate, placebo domino and regione vivorum. From the Latin placebo, I shall please, future indicative of placere, to please. Medical sense is recorded in 1785, a medicine given more to please than to benefit the patient. It's interesting. Had no idea it meant pleasing. I'm now not even sure I know what to please means.
Etymology is so amazing. You can just trace the arc, you know? And of course, like a word such as please has its own separate relative arc. But anyway, I love etymology as well.
Yeah, I noticed that most of my chronic pain is lateralized down my body in systematic ways, in ways that I can discern or interrelated. Like my jaw, for example, I think is related to my hips. So there seems to be this connection in my life or in my experience between my teeth and my legs, which is really bizarre. And there could be a genetic basis for that, but or like my eye and my shoulder. Like there are these bizarre connections that I sometimes become aware of. And like sometimes I wonder to what extent certain portions of the body could be used to influence or navigate to others, like as a kind of terrain. If you were to imagine the body as a terrain, how they might be connected in ways that aren't obvious in external space, but in ways that the dream environment might make more evident.
Okay, there's something very powerful there. I'm not sure if I can put my finger on it.
It's like due to some compression effect in external space, which appears differently in the dream, but yeah. It's like more temporally elongated or something. So it allows certain memories to reappear.
So what you're saying, though, bears a resemblance to other things you've suggested about how the forms of organisms can be understood in a way that resembles a timeline. The emergence of form in a sequence of recursively self-expressing aspects that can be seen in a linear perspective, such that the actual relationships between what we think of as distinct organs are invisible to dissection, but can be rendered visible by retemporalizing the sequence of their emergence in linear time. Okay, I know that was a big fucking mouthful, but does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, of course. This is what I'm always talking about.
Right, great. Yeah, I was trying to say what I've taken from what you've said, and in this sense, the relationship. Okay, so there's something even weirder going on, which is I would suggest that the relationship between the teeth and the body is so different from what we imagine that it might be as if the teeth are superior instances of the body's entire structure.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, that's what I'm calling a retrieval key. You can use it as
Yeah.
a key to retrieve a larger whole. And that's what also happens in memory, as in the dream environment. So yeah, I guess that's the connection that I was going for.
And also, it should be obvious to anyone who's actually given it some thought, and if any of us have been to the dentist, we may have had the similar insights or not, but the teeth are like living stones. They are the rock. Like the bone is not like rock. The teeth are literally like living rocks in our mouth. They enable things that are otherwise impossible. They are very strange features of the affordances of the body. I think it would be very difficult to speak without them.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Like I mentioned before, how I suspect that the skull encodes information about the rest of the body. But I was recently looking into horse anatomy, and I realized that like the body of the horse exemplifies this kind of limb-based element. So like the horse is basically just a big leg. You can see the leg force sort of extended into its toes. So like basically as well as its skull. So its entire face is like a big leg. And the teeth, I think, are carrying elements for that force. So as you extend the leg principle, you influence the teeth. There's like this interesting connection that I've realized in my own experience.
Yeah, I mean, this points up the catastrophic misformulation of anatomy, right? Anatomy, just like our other ontologies, it sees separate parts, then it puts them back together in the body, claims they have no relationship, right? The brain is in your head. Really, how do you get a brain without a heart? You don't. There are no brains without hearts. Zero. Do you get brains without livers? Nope. How do you even get to the idea of a separate organ? You have to make a bunch of catastrophically stupid presumptions to get there. And then once you've done that, now you have to defend all those presumptions against any other position.
Right. Yeah.
On that line, I'm interested to develop this a little further still. It's, this is probably obvious from the normative science basis, right? But like, you mentioned, George, that maybe chronic pain has kind of a genetic basis. Just as an aside, I know you were stretching, you moved to a bigger point. This dissecting approach that you're highlighting, Darren, about anatomy. Yeah, it's oh boy, it's wrong.
Yeah, it can't. These are things, again, there's this really weird feature of our modern ontologies and knowledge traditions where you have fundamental assumptions that not only are wrong, it's impossible for them to be correct.
Yeah.
Yet they are asserted as the absolute authoritative version of reality. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh yeah, no, it's scary what's proffered as the bedrock of reality through these models. So, we have genetics, right? That is a concept, at least. And there's this idea, as we've talked about, Darwin proffered that organisms or whatever are the expression of those genetics. But, as folks are learning, or better understanding maybe, of course, our genes are regulated by a huge host of proteins and enzymes that turn them on or off depending on environmental stimuli. All of our gene replication and construction of proteins and enzymes from our dreams are heavily regulated, again, turned on and off in various ways. They're turned on and off by these hormonal signals. Those hormones come from glands, of course, that, again, in this description, are guided by the electrical impulses of the nervous system. The nervous system guides the replication of your genes, the expression of their proteins, the, whatever physical, again, from a normative perspective, based on how you feel and what you think. And it's interesting that your body, all of the tissues, everything about it has I'm going to use the word evolved here, maybe co-grown, has emerged in this complex interrelationship, not just with the electrons of your neurology alone, but the very content of your consciousness throughout. But not only that, we, whatever we are in this complex interdependent relationship with all of the manifestations of our environment as well, simultaneously. And simultaneous to that, we're in some kind of arc of development of species and complexification, or, maybe in the modern sense, decomplexifications of environmental contexts. But it's fascinating. All this stems from consciousness. Ultimately, it's a reflection of it. But there's this really interesting thing about a horse being one muscle, right? And, what I'm reminded of, if one was to make a video, like the Coke and Coca-Cola thing is such a great hook, right? There's this other hook that's been spoken of just for a very long time, the debate between whether or not a horse leaves the ground entirely in its gallop, right? Because what this reminded me of is that if you watch a horse, being a horse, at different speeds, at different rhythms, at different time scales, when it goes from a walk to a trot to, there's an intermediate step, but to a gallop, you see the different rhythms of their interactions play out, within their context. It's a rhythmic thing. But at its fullest expression, horses run like their backs arch. Their fastest, most expressed run is one arc of the stretch of their entire body, one muscle, right? And of course, it's like teeth strapped to a rocket. It's like that leads the charge in almost all animals, which is very interesting to me if you dig deep through time and evolution and the nature of origin. Not that that's primary, but there's one muscle, one idea,
Right.
bringing forth.
Its skull is like a fifth limb, so its teeth predominate. Actually, I think its teeth are larger than its brain. So if you were to take all of its teeth, if you sort of see the cross section of the skull, it's really fascinating. And yeah, the different trots are also really fascinating. I think there are 4 distinguishable trots traditionally. Yeah, but the principle at work here seems to be opposition to gravity. So the horse stands on its toes. Basically, its entire hand is a leg. So the leg has been extended, the leg principle has been extended down, like spatialized, into the hand or foot. And it stands up on a single finger, its middle finger. So the hoof is actually the middle finger of the horse's leg. Yeah, so this kind of carrying principle, this opposition to gravity is blown up. It's like if you were to blow it out, that sort of inflation also happens in the skull. And I think you see it within the teeth structure and their sheer size. Yeah, it's really fascinating. There's some kind of connecting link there. And when I mentioned genetics, I was talking more about like these homeobox genes or these body plan genes that people like to talk about nowadays. Like they're like proteins or genes can apparently code for more than one part of the body. So when it comes to chronic pain, sometimes I wonder whether the links that I perceive in my own body have a genetic basis or a genetic correlate. But I'm actually not convinced that DNA sort of informs the structure of the body. Um, I'm fairly convinced that there's a distinction there between form and DNA. So you can change the DNA of an organism without radically altering its form. But these homeobox genes in particular are interesting because they suggest a link between genes and parts of the body, like between your teeth and your legs, for example. Like I think your kidneys and your inner ear bone are genetically related. So if you were to sort of knock out one of those genes, you would affect more than one part of the body because the body is a holistic structure. So like even these H condyles that were part of human evolution, very similar. So like your yeah, what was it? There's a connection between encephalization. Um, yeah, there's a connection between what is it, encephalization and like your skin texture. I forget what they are. Like these androgen receptors that were knocked out like 2 million years ago in Homo erectus, presumably, right? Gave rise to our naked skin, like our relative hairlessness and our large brains. It was one contributing factor. So it wasn't as if like evolution happened piecemeal. We were living in a forest environment until some kind of rapid event took place that um, allowed us to lose our hair, and that sort of opened us up to traveling on the savannah. So it wasn't like like Darwin said. Um, we sort of left as a complete package. We were already more or less human. Like it wasn't like Lucy or something. Like, although Lucy probably had a place, but
Yeah, just to that effect, it's notable between mammals. We share some, I don't know, upwards of 90% of identical genetics. With things like plants, we still share a substantial amount of our genetics. And that's interesting, for sure.
yeah, the form of the body is more like a resonance phenomenon. So it reflects the environment, not like a mirror necessarily, but in terms of certain relations. Like if you look at the Sheldon spectrum, the distribution of the sizes of plankton in the ocean, I think it follows a certain logarithmic scale. So the sizes of organisms in the ocean aren't random structures. They weren't randomly evolved or acquired. They're actually some kind of resonance phenomenon. So if you knock out a certain species, the entire ocean changes, just like a human body or any organism. Like if you knock out one gene, the entire form changes. And that's what these homeobox genes indicate. But the same phenomenon happens in the environment. It's like if you take a species out, the entire ecology will transform, just like a body. And that's the sense in which your body isn't actually distinct from the external world. There's no dualism between what happens in space and what happens within your own body. Um, so yeah, that's really fascinating too. Like these scaling laws in evolution that your metabolism reflects, like in Kleiber's law. But the Sheldon spectrum is another instance of it. So the ocean is a coherent body. The entire ocean is an organism. It's not like a thing or some environment that things are moving through and evolving in. Like that's ridiculous, man. It's not seen in the right way when it's approached from that angle as something that organisms are indwelling and finding niches within. Like that's not going on at all. in my view.
Yeah, I think my favorite analogy of this, is Yellowstone Park, as wolves were removed and elk ran rampant. There's a lot, and I'm sure DB, we've talked about this in the past, but the way the complex ecosystem, this is always described as like one species and its tensioned balance against another. But the entire character of the park changed, and that speaks to the truth behind it.
Yeah, and one of the things that these so-called wildlife managers don't understand is that these things kind of grow from the bottom up. So, say in Alaska, for instance, they think that like killing 80% of the wolves will magically make the moose numbers boom. And they don't even factor into their little analysis, the human impacts of destroying the actual basis for moose to survive. So I don't know if it's just deliberate or they are really that stupid, but yeah, it's like you can see the wolves and other kind of carnivore animals as like a feedback loop that is completely dependent on, say, the moose, elk, deer, hare, rabbit, etc. feedback loop. And that's dependent on the bigger feedback loop, which is the entire habitat, the ocean cycles, the seasons in which all these animals are accustomed, the health of the flora and the soil and the insects especially. Yeah, so it's I've always seen it as a body, as a gigantic body. The terrain, the sky, and the ocean and the rivers and the mountains is a body. And so mostly what these wildlife managers do is harmful, I think.
There's a direction here I think is really interesting, at least to me, but I don't want to entirely depart if others have thoughts on this, but so there's this kind of environment, ecological awareness, I'll just call it the Gaia thing, but if we take that and individualize it again, and take it from the perspective of I wanted to say an actor within that environment, but that is already complicated, right? It's interesting that the wolves desire the elk, and that the desire, the need or the love, I don't know, it shapes the elk, right? And at least for disease, at least for overgrazing, at least for, in so many ways, the elk are shaped by the wolves and of course shape the wolves. And together, this shapes Yellowstone Park or plankton in the ocean. In this way, it's really interesting. We often think that we plant corn everywhere. We desire corn. But of course, from another perspective, the corn has become the most successful plant on the planet, interestingly, occupying more hectares and getting more care than practically any other plant on the planet. And so, in a way, we desire the cheap calories and the, corn chips we eat. And the corn desires our shelter, our service, our agency of it. And together from that desire, from that mutual set of desires, a whole world erupts. A world of, well, whatever this is, lots of people, that's for sure. Global warming and Disney movies. It erupts from that system, which is and we can take this back a step when the church desired bread, Maybe the church desired bread to feed armies, or because it was fungible. And the wheat, it needed some human servant to plow the field and plant it. You know, just the way the ants carry aphids to my garden plants to then consume the aphids or their dew, you know, sweet nectar. There's this relationship there. It's really interesting to me. But in ancient times, before words, you know, the caves were adorned not with literal depictions of the deer, but this fetishized depiction. You know, like if you look at the cave paintings, of course, in France and whatnot, other people know this much better than I, but it's notable how artistic and non-literal they are. There's this idea alive, you know, in what they're depicting. I can't, you know, I don't know what it's like to feel being a wolf chasing deer. You know, and at some point we were humans who had this intimate relationship with our game. We chased each other around the earth as the sun crossed our paths 1,000 times for eons. We had this relationship, and from it erupted a world, you know, and all the other relationships. And it's interesting. This is kind of stretching toward the tool thing. You know, our words are tools of a sort. You know, our language and our concrete specific thoughts, you know, our cognitive representations are a tool of sorts to help us, you know, allegedly to help us navigate our affordances. But that's alleged because there's some strange loop there. There's some, you know, not us motivating the action, right? Like there's underneath our sense of agency is this loop, this circuit of experience somehow manufacturing the world we inhabit. And I think it goes still deeper, you know, but I guess I'll just pause there. I don't know if that stirs up anything, but that's a line that I'm really curious about.
Yeah. You know, so I always say that, you know, language is the gradual eclipse of the symbolic source of the embodiment of a technical object. So language externalizes temporal selection, which enables humans to structure time consciously in a very primitive way. So technology begins as a symbolic extension of this process. And when I talk about symbols, I mean something like a more originary kind of thinking, which is mostly absent from modern life. So tools first appeared, I think, as living metaphors or bridges like organisms that bound the human body to the cosmos and that made certain forms of action possible, which were tied to cosmogonic myths. So the idea of regenerating the cosmos periodically is an ancient traditional point of view among humans everywhere. So tools seem to have been originally wedded to this process of cosmic renewal or retrieval or resurrection, which takes certain forms later in history, of course, we know. But over time, this symbolic origin fades and this original kind of thinking disappears, but it leaves behind these husks, these objects that serve functional roles rather than cosmological roles. And so you can find evidence for this everywhere in any tool today. If you sort of trace its history back, you'll discover that it originated in this symbolic kind of nexus that was cosmological in nature. So, you know, usually, you know, we associate that with shamanism, but that's kind of a loaded term. But writing systems also have a similar point of origin, because writing systems were originally used for divine inscriptions and for cosmic correspondence. So it reflected this deeper kind of cosmic understanding of the human body and its role in nature, its role in the cosmos, what it actually does. But over time, writing systems also, like tools, evolved into these neutral means of recording transactions and laws and stuff like that. And we see that today in like computer systems and in governments. But yeah, both technology and language, I think, exhibit the same kind of trajectory. They inform each other. They have this autonomous quality, so they have this kind of independent spirit, which now subordinates us, sort of controls us in this feedback loop in a certain respect. So, yeah, that's that's sort of my perspective on that.
That's brilliant. I have a few comments. So I'm going to say back what I took from some of what you said. Originally, the symbolic intelligence of humans was profoundly related to what I call uplink, or to the reception and incarnation of divine intelligence, or the supernatural, whatever you want to call it. But over time, what happened was that representation and symbols became the fossilized antithetical remnant left over from the evacuation of that from our common experience. Much like our smartphones are today, essentially a representation of uplink that is dead inside and filled with a bunch of dead recordings. Novelty replaces, like visual novelty replaces something like theurgy. Sarah talks at length, Sarah Janes, about her experience of learning to read hieroglyphs and how that mode of symbolic engraving is radically different from ours, because it includes features of nature such that one who reads hieroglyphs will see hieroglyphs in natural phenomena all day long, right? It's constant with our experience of nature and being alive. The symbols are actual things in our experience that can come together. So she noticed after a time that she would encounter examples not just of hieroglyphs, but of statements in hieroglyphic language in nature. Imagine the difference between a system like that and ours, where that never happens. That is impossible in English.
Or rather, we have subdued the natural world and created a world of square corners and signposts everywhere where it's
No, there's something, yes, that's true. There's something far weirder going on though, that, which is instead of seeing the symbolic in the natural, we place that experience with signs.
Exactly.
Billboards.
Yeah.
The word of showers, menus, right? So what happens is the eviction of the originary into dead forms that euthanize us. They euthanize our consciousness and our participatory relationship with emergence and existence. They literally put it to death. It's a kind of strange opposite of anesthesia.
Yeah. But when you learn to see the horse or the raccoon or the human being in the right way, you can return to or resurrect that form of cognition, because in that form of cognition, there's no distinction between perception and knowledge. And that's very much like what you're describing when you see symbols in your environment. You start perceiving symbols themselves. So there's no distinction between the appearance of the symbol and the act of knowing. That's what I'm always harping on about.
Me too, in my own way. We have unique complementary figurations of this. So if one sees a wolf as the word of the sky, the living speech of that which is to form, as the sun is to light, the speaker of forms. The speaker of forms makes the chrysanthemum, the jellyfish, the octopus, the whale, the raccoon, the horse, the wolf, the aphid, the ant, the speaker of forms. This must have been obvious to the ancients. So obvious that it forged their awareness. It was not an effect in their awareness. Their awareness was comprised of this.
First, we make our tools, and then our tools make us. I mean, it's
But the
beautiful.
us that is resulting is dead inside. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. And well, you know, I think everything you said is beautiful, and I agree very much. But there's something interesting here. I want to shy away from using the ultimate for a moment. It's interesting, so in this idea of the behavioral loop, the relationship that erupts, between the cave painter and his game, the story of the universe, the understanding, understanding just the whole experience that erupts from that relationship is a relationship of desire, a desire loop that draws the hunter into intimacy with the game, right? And from that, if that were not the case, well, in a normal way, at least the hunter would probably just starve to death, and everyone would be cool with that, and that'd be the end of it, right? But it's interesting the way that manufactures that relationship resonates and creates a world all around it, just like the dentist and my tooth. I have some dental pain, so I go to the dentist, and they give me a partial cure, and I come back again. From this relationship, I get a partial cure. From the relationship, they get money, and from that erupts this reality of understanding and dentistry. From this desire loop, a technology erupts. And what is that technology? It is the manifest world. It is somehow reality. Now, if that's preferential, if that's the reality we'd preference over another reality we'd preference, is interesting, But deep down, I don't remember where I saw this, but this loop of desire and how it manifests, quote unquote reality, whatever we'd call that, our experience, our, whatever it is. It's not something that can be vanquished. It's not something to be like, it's interesting the way that our tools themselves are, they're not wholly bad or wholly good, but somehow they're a means by which the affordances we understand are manifest to us. And that's complicated and interesting to me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, see, that establishes the link between ancient religion and Coca-Cola, because Coca-Cola is a religion, dude. I mean, so you have to see the connection.
Every product is a religion.
Yeah.
Nike is a religion.
Sorry, what's that?
All those things are, every product is a religion. Nike
Yeah.
is a religion.
Yeah, so seeing that connection is important.
Also, it strikes me in listening to Corn-Fed just now, something that I've been aware of sort of subconsciously, which is that a trip to the doctor or the dentist is literally a representation of the transmigration of souls. It is the replacement for what the Greeks were doing, but it is the same kind of thing. We leave the universe of common experience. A god, literally, a god, arises in the form of the dentist. The angels are his assistants. The god,
I love this.
right? The god causes effective changes, but there's a whole, not merely hypnotic and not merely religious, there is a transcendental transaction occurring in representation, but it's not merely representation. The trip to the dentist is the same kind of fossilized remains that is more functional, perhaps, of what the Elephsis, death and resurrection. You literally get okay, look.
Yeah.
You literally get anesthetized, all right? So is that not the little appearance of the representation of dying and being reborn? All of these things are ritually transcendental to our common experience. We leave the regular world of self and other and known things. We go into a highly specialized environment in which we are anesthetized, and we emerge somehow transformed. It's very important to be aware of this. I've never been so consciously aware of it before, though I was modestly aware. But now in my mind, I see, in part in response to how Corn-Fed structured my concerns with his sharing, right? This becomes blatantly obvious. And the drinking of a Coca-Cola is very similar, as is the putting on of a Nike shoe. These are rituals, fundamentally transcendental, right? They transform our identity and our experience of identity, and they associate our identity with gods.
Yes.
And so the modern aspect of becoming associated with a god is the preference for a product. In my own life, the Apple computer is a god that I have long served and am deeply intimate with.
It's crazy magical.
The guitars and the synthesizers are gods. And there are very specific gods that I select to effloresce daringness inwardly and extrinsically. These products are the replacements of gods. They are hypostatic, they are representational hypostases of the lost relationship with the divine. And once you evacuate that, or once you begin the process of that evacuation, this engenders the process of the death of participation into, right, into the relationship with product.
Yeah, the mechanical clock is a carnal embodiment of the cycles in organisms. So as opposed to thinking that clocks measure time, really clocks are the death of a certain kind of time. That's what a clock
Right.
is.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's this kind of mechanical cycle that, yeah, reflects a deeper understanding of cycles in the cosmos. So it's really a
And
death.
its necessary result is an Alexandrian library of forms of slavery.
Yeah, so it sets up this clock of desire that Cornfed's talking about, like this kind of cycle of addiction, like Coca-Cola or the
It
dentist.
wrests that desire away from the cycle of life in your body and the cycle of life in the external world as well.
The whole idea of an intoxicant is, wildly unnecessary unless uplink is lost. And we can see, for example, in the introduction of extremely toxic forms of whiskey and so forth to the indigenous people, how that replaced ecstasy, participation, role. I don't want to call what they were doing ritual because I think it's pre-ritualistic, actually. But yeah, the intoxicant just replaces and kills that stuff. I'm not sure this was always the way, but it's certainly part of the way in modernity. Coca-Cola was an intoxicant originally. I've got some pages here that I'd like to read if the group is amenable, that are related to the topics at hand.
Yeah, let's go for it.
I'd love to hear it.
Okay, this is some really good stuff.
DB, I don't know if you're trying to speak, but we're getting some background too.
Oh, sorry. I'll mute. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm trying to find what I had. Let's see here. Here we go. So this is from Language and Myth by Ernst Cassirer. It's a very small book that is one of the most amazing books I've ever come across. But mythic ideation and primitive verbal conception recognize no such content of experience. Their function, as we have seen, is rather a process of almost violent separation and individuation. Only when this intense individuation has been consummated, when the immediate intuition has been focused and one might say reduced to a single point, does the mythic or linguistic form emerge, and the word or the momentary God is created. And this particular genesis determines the type of intellectual content that is common in language and myth, for where the process of apprehension aims not at an expansion, extension, universalizing of the content, but rather at its highest intensification, this fact cannot fail to influence human consciousness. This is where things get interesting. All other things are lost to a mind thus enthralled. All bridges between concrete datum and the systematized totality of experience are broken. Only the present reality, as mythic or linguistic conception, stresses and shapes it, fills the entire subjective realm. So this one content of experience must reign over practically the whole experiential world. There is nothing beside it or beyond it whereby it could be measured or to which it could be compared. Its mere presence is the sum of all being. At this point, the word which denotes that thought content is not a mere conventional symbol, but is merged with its object in an indissoluble unity. The conscious experience is not merely wedded to the word, but is consumed by it. Whatever has been fixed by a name henceforth is not only real, it is reality. The potential between symbol and meaning is resolved. In a place of more or less adequate expansion, we find a relation of identity, of complete congruence between image and object, between the name and the thing. It goes on to say, this is a quote from Seven Against Thebes by Aeschylus. Life and victory depend upon direction and power, as also on the goodwill of the weapon. This feeling wells up irresistibly in the crucial moment of the battle, and prayer does not invoke a god from afar to guide the weapon. The weapon itself is God, the helper and deliverer. An implement, then, is never regarded as something simply manufactured, something thought of and produced, but as a gift from above. Its origin does not go back to man himself, but to some culture hero, either a god or an animal. This attribution of all cultural values to a savior is so universal that attempts have been made to find the essence and origin of the God concept in this notion. Again, we are faced with a characteristic of mythic thinking which divides it sharply from the way of discursive or theoretical reflection. The latter is characterized by the fact that even in apparently immediately given data, it recognizes an element of mental creation and stresses this active ingredient. It goes on and on and on. Read forever. This book is fucking insane. You can get it for like $5. I strongly recommend it. Language and Myth by Ernst Cassirer.
Yeah, I have the book actually.
Yeah.
Can you give me the page number? I'll try to find it.
Yeah. I think so. I haven't lost it. Let's see.
Yeah, I read that book. Maybe
I just read it over and over and over. I just keep reading it.
Yeah, I think you had actually his philosophy of symbolic forms.
I do, yeah.
Yeah, I want to read. Yeah, that guy
I was
was
lucky enough to get the 3-volume copy of that. Page 60 and page 57, I think. I was
Okay,
reading
thanks.
from.
Yeah, I'll check it out.
But yeah, we're really on to something here. This the trip to the dentist's office, but similarly the trip to the grocery store, right? That is a relationship with the God that brings the things to us. Amazon is a God, right? The internet is a representation of a kind of an anti-heaven, or it's a representation of what people, I think they're very confused when they do this generally, refer to as the Akashic records, right? Which is sort of the memory of all things above time in the universal cognitium. Each of these technologies represent what they destroy, and they don't have to do that. That's not the only option for technology. It's the result, I think, primarily of humans being captured on a specific branch of the possibility space of representational cognition, one that only becomes accessible if uplink is broken. If uplink is unbroken, then there are guiding intelligences that very firmly, and they don't compel you, they inform you in such a way that sin becomes either wildly unlikely or impossible. Sin not being the doing of a thing for which you will be damned. Sin being the result of layered losses of awareness and ignorance and confusion that arise on a world of bees where there are no longer flowers, right? On a world of fish where the water is gone, where the purposive nature of their origin and form is lost in their awareness. This loss produces a cascade of forgettings, and those forgettings lead to the enaction of things that no one would ever enact in a situation even where the communal local intelligence was still accessible, right? Even if there were no gods and there was no thing above the humans, which I wildly doubt, right? Even in a relatively coherent tribe of persons, the collective takes on the function of uplink, even if there's nothing to link to, which again, I catastrophically doubt, but I'm willing to entertain.
You know, I mean, it's my impression McGilchrist goes on and on about this in a way I think that's parallel to what we're describing.
Yeah, absolute genius. Yeah, I profoundly trust and am inspired by him.
Yeah, he seems earnest, for sure.
He's doing the thing he's talking about. This is really important. So what he's doing is he's placing his left hemisphere at the so to speak, at the disposal of the purposive orientations of the silent hemisphere.
With his academic approach in particular. Yeah. Well,
he's doing what he's saying. This is super important. It's very rare to encounter this, I think. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Cornfed.
Oh, no, that's great. And the, you know, the thing that kind of, you know, resonates with regard to our conversation is the totalitarian nature of the particularizing left hemisphere. You know, at a point, the scales tip, you know, just as you described in your reading, right? There's a point at which overly empowered, if our minds are formatted by this particularizing, dissecting notion, it, you know, especially as a culture, right? We can create an entire ontology based on particularizing, on categorizing. And it vanquishes that, you know, more complete knowing, and it actively destroys it. And then you have things like wildlife biologists going around shooting the wolves to like repair the elk. You know, it doesn't, that absolute particularization, you know, the scale has broken and become unbalanced in this way. At least that's what I was reminded of.
Yeah. So how can Korzybski help us here, Darren?
My God. So there's probably 15 tools. And I don't want to become didactic right now because we're having such a beautiful sort of orchestral play together. But the most fundamental of them is the realization that underlies non-Aristotelian logic, which obliterates the law of the excluded middle and replaces it with the law of excluded identity. So what that looks like is whatever we say a thing is, that is what it is not. The thing that we use to point with is merely a pointer, and what it points to is always and irrevocably infinite and incomplete. Recognizing that, we are freed from the trap of what he calls identification. There's a story where, there's a bunch of stories from Korzybski's life. There's a book about him that's quite fascinating, which a friend of mine gifted me. It's a huge tome. It's sort of his biography. It's great. But there's a story, he was a spy in World War I think for the Poles. He was Polish. And there's a bunch of stories about him that are fascinating. He was tasked with using the evidence. I think the Russians had this particular weapon. Might not have been the Russians. I don't know who it was. Could have been Germans. they had this weapon that was absolutely devastating. It was an artillery gun. And they tasked him with going to the sites where this weapon, the shell had landed, and forensically examining that site to determine the location of the weapon so that it could then be hunted down and destroyed. And he was quite successful at this to such a degree, this is hilarious and brilliant, that the army using the weapon began to use it to hunt him, right? Because he was destroying that weapon so effectively by his forensic examination of its landing zones, right? That they started to just use it to hunt him. I mean, I don't know, just. They were probably using it for other things as well. And anyway, there's a story where he's in a train car and he's talking to someone, separate story. And he sits down on a chair in the little cubby hole in the train, and he's talking with the person. And the chair collapses, but he doesn't fall down. He just stands up from the chair as it collapses. And the shocked interlocutor says, "How did you not fall down?" And Korzybski said, "I never believed that was a chair." So non-identification, non-allness, we should notice that when we use tokens, we should resist the urge to understand that they are complete, right? That they are sufficient and complete. That is a tree, is an untrue statement. That isn't anything, is an untrue statement. So he transforms the trap from concreteness. Perhaps he recognizes a useful facility in these games of language and identity. Then he also introduces a couple of other things that I can briefly state. The first is to use a temporal subscript when we are describing a person or phenomenon, and also possibly a locational subscript. He does this he gives examples of this in Science and Sanity, but I can show you exactly what it means. So if I said John went to the store, what would happen in thought is the version of John circa August 7th, 1925, 4:57 p.m., beginning at the corner of, Main and 2nd Street, went to the store. That subscript alerts us to the fact that John is not a continuous known phenomenon. These kinds of habits, which appear overwrought at first glance, right? There's a page in Science and Sanity, which is probably not too difficult to locate, in which the 15 tools that he employs as abbreviations are explained. But yeah, temporal and locational subscripts alert us to the fact that John is an unknown phenomenon, and that John has only at certain times and in certain situations does John have qualities that we would recognize as John-like. In other times and situations, those qualities change.
Right.
They are not reliable. They are not continuous.
Huh.
And this transforms how we process identity once we take these toys online. We don't have to become tyrannical with them for them to have a profound effect on cognition, which he suggests literally structures the nervous system.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So that brings us back to hypnosis.
So let's talk about a couple of other things that Korzybski discovered. So he would treat people. He was a therapist, right? And he would treat them for illnesses and psychopathologies using non-Aristotelian methods. So he met this woman, and she was catastrophically allergic to roses. And they had many sessions together. And then one day he showed up at her house with a bouquet of roses. And she got very angry with him, began sneezing uncontrollably and getting hives on her skin and freaking out. How could you possibly do this? You know how? And he said, ma'am, these are not roses. These are artificial flowers. And she was cured. So what he noticed was that the humans are responding to what they think things are in such a fundamental way that they develop illnesses and injuries around them. And rather than treating those allopathically, he was treating them cognitively by changing what they think reality is.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, this is a very different instance of the similar phenomenon of going to the dentist, except in this case, Korzybski's like, you have cavities in your cognition and they're fucking you up.
Right. Okay.
Let's replace those with something else, right?
Yeah. Now I can see a lot of connections to what I already tend to say here. So can you tell me more about time binding?
Yeah, so time binding can have different meanings. And I'm not an expert on dissertations about Korzybski. I'm more someone who has internalized some of his methods.
Sure.
But time binding is the problem that you have of inheriting the pathological evaluations of previous humans. When you learn language, you are receiving the result of time binding. Humans, he says, are time binders. And what that means is we produce, collect, and enact a library of concepts and identities which would never ordinarily arise in our awareness or cognition unless we inherited them. So time binding is the reception of the historical lexicons, conceptual and linguistic, models, methods of evaluation. Primarily, he's concerned with evaluation, right? Because that's really what everything is in consciousness, from one perspective. It's comparison, it's evaluation, it's measuring, it's identification, right? And so what he's saying is, you know, along with useful features, like he certainly wouldn't, I think, having been a mathematician himself, I doubt he would say mathematics is a deleterious form of time binding. I think he would agree that it's a useful and profound aspect of time binding. So there must be things that aren't nearly pathological, but the vast majority of the catalogs that we inherit is pathological and is essentially a vast collection of compelling fictions. So the therapeutic move is to disabuse ourselves of those, to understand the structural nature of their wrongness, which, you know, has nothing to do with what George does, obviously.
Well, does he see the mind and the body as the same phenomenon?
It's very complicated. He's a madman, and he's functioning like, you know, Alfred Korzybski, subscript 1927 to 1940, whatever, right? Like, he's also in time, and he's in a context, and he studied some neurology, but misunderstands portions of it rather dramatically compared to modern understandings, and is also insane. So, like, one of the things one of the things he says is, criminals have given up their right to participate in society by engaging in criminal acts, so they should just become guinea pigs for science. Right? You can do whatever you want with those. Mm-hmm. Which is, of course, I think, insane.
Well, I mean, this sounds like a tool for going insane, which is yeah,
well, he would argue
at one level, not in its totality, but it can be used that way. Like any.
No,
form
he would
of
argue. I mean,
like...
literally, I discovered him because of the writings of a science fiction author called A.E. Van Vo, who wrote in a couple of books, including The Players of Null A, about a Null A detective named Gilbert Gosane, Goy, Goysane, I think. And Gilbert's job was to solve crimes that were committed with time machines.
Right.
In these books, which are brilliant and fascinating, this is how I discovered Korzybski when I was 17 and got my first copy of Science and Sanity from the library and tried to understand it and failed miserably because I took one of its precepts literally, which was there's no way to learn this unless you're trained by someone who's accomplished in it. You can't just learn this by reading the book. So I just believed that, which isn't really entirely true. In any case, in the books, it supposes a future where humanity is branched, and there's a branch that took up null A and became superhuman, and they live on Venus, which they've terraformed, and the terrestrial humans contract out to them to solve various kinds of problems. There are problems you cannot solve without null A tools. It might be that most problems cannot be solved without them.
Right.
Because if you start out with a collection of presumptions that are lethal to understanding or insight, what's your next move?
Well, the way that he
The
described...
modern ontology.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, what's that?
Oh, I just think that underpins the modern ontology, as we've discussed. But sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
It does.
Well, the way that he describes the distinction between plants, animals, and humans actually reflects my own, which I find really interesting. Because I haven't, delved into his books at all.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure about how he describes that, but what he does describe...
Well, I can see here that he called plants energy binding and animals space binding, which basically reflects what I already think.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I find that really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, his toy, the structural differential, is very profound. I'd like to manufacture them. I've long had that that goal. It shouldn't be very difficult to do. I need to find a handyman who can craft them. Because there's nowhere to get one. All you can get is a representation of them. And he basically said that you have to physicalize the understanding by practicing with the structural differential.
Have you described this before? Yeah. Would you like to describe the toy? The
structural
device?
Differential? Sure. I'll give a very simple description of it that's incomplete. Oh, of course, all descriptions are incomplete. But so you have like a broken parabola at the top with a bunch of holes in it. And the reason that it's broken at the top, is that it goes on forever. So those holes are derivable qualities of an event, situation, or object or being, right? And there are an infinite number of those holes, which is why it's jagged at the top of the parabola. That's at the top of the toy. And it's basically like there are these little circles and tags on a stick that stands up. The parabola is at the top. This is easy to find online. So what you have are, underneath that, you have like a circle with some peg holes in it. And to the left of that, on an arm, you have another circle with some peg holes in it. And then underneath those circles, you have these tags that hang down. They're rectangular, and they have a few holes in them. And so what humans do is a thing that Julian Jaynes called excerption. And this toy illustrates that very directly. And it's something that humans are generally unconscious of doing. And so what you do is you take a peg with a string on it from the parabola down into the first circle, which could be understood as what an animal might derive from experience. And then you take a couple of other pegs and strings with pegs on the ends, and you connect them from the parabola to the first circle. So you get maybe 3 or 5 derived properties of an experience. Then you take a few of those and you connect those over to the human, what a human will make. Of course, the human, what they will make is often conceptual, which the animal is probably not doing, and or linguistic and or symbolic. And then you just hang some tags off that thing and connect a few things down to those things, and those are what you would think of as function or value or identity. So you learn that the phenomena is infinite, and that an animal, you are an animal, right? So you make some of the animalian derivations over the continuum of the phenomena. And then from there, you make a few, you conserve or derive a few other qualities or properties or values. This is what evaluation is. And what you notice in continually doing this with any given phenomena, a rose, a trip to the grocery store, the cut on my finger, is that you're doing something that has very little to do with the phenomena. It has to do with a bunch of habits. And those habits are deleteriously compelling in that they limit the scope of the phenomana's availability to your participation and awareness very dramatically with each step. So you're effectively evicting understanding and awareness, and then thinking that the resulting derivations are good, true, believable, valid, so forth. This is a very crude description, and probably slightly inaccurate in some features.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you. The habit of this particularization. Yeah.
Excerption, false evaluation, false conclusion leads to false behavior is the simple problem. You'd be better off with non-evaluation in many cases.
Sounds awfully Buddhist. I don't know.
Yeah, who would have guessed, right? My friends, I must depart for now. So grateful, as always, for this time with you and our explorations and enthusiasm and passion and curiosity and medicinal insight.
Likewise.
All
Yeah,
blessings. Yeah, all blessings to you. Hope to see you all again soon. Peace for now.
Thank you for all you bring and all you intend. Cheers.
Sorry, I've been quiet. I've been sorting meat this whole time. I'm still doing that.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah, so that was pretty cool. What he said before you left. When I sit down to write or draw, I literally have to take like 5 minutes to decompress. So, wind everything down so that way I'm not thinking about anything. And then I can start, because if my mind is doing anything like that, I can't focus. So, yeah, it has to be completely still. And then, what I call my friends of what I call my friends in eternity start to awaken and help me out.
Do you have a process that you prefer to clear your mind in that way? This is something that I have a few, like meditation and stuff, but it's been more of a struggle than I would like just lately. And so I'm kind of curious to hear if you have a interesting process.
Um, I mostly do that exercise Hugh gave us. At the end of the Extinctionati meetings, like he introduced that sometime in like meeting 70s, in the 70s or 60s of the meetings. I can't remember which one particular. He introduced the exercise where you basically do like a full inventory of your body. You kind of get grounded in your senses. You sit in the phonic pose in a chair, which is perfect because that's how I naturally sit anyway, with my back perfectly straight. So like make a right angle. And then you close your eyes and you focus on the back of your eyelids. And you don't try to control your breathing or anything. And if your focus starts to drift, then you just bring it back, go through your senses again, like listen, feel your skin, feel the chair, become aware of the taste in your mouth, and then the smells, and then focus beyond your eyelids again. But for me, it usually takes like 2 or 3 times, and then I'm good to go.
That's great. Thank you. Well, I don't know. I don't have a ton of time, I think, but I have a loose ticket. you know, um, I don't know if you're still interested in talking about Greenland, or if there's some other subject that might be interesting, either DB or George.
Oh no, I was looking forward to that too. So
Sorry, what was that, corn-fed? I turned on the faucet and then you spoke and I couldn't hear you.
Oh
Sorry.
yeah, no worries. A while back, George had kind of registered a curiosity, to get perspectives, I think, on Trump and Greenland. And, I don't know, there's probably 7 or 8 different things that kind of come to my mind with regard to that. But do you want to characterize that more, George? Or, direct the interest, or what you wanted to say or anything?
well, I really wonder what Lord Hugh would have made of it. So I was just curious to get your perspective, because I figured that you might know something about it, or you might be following it. I haven't been following it as closely as I probably should, so um, any updates would be good. Like just what you think the motivation is, or any sort of forecasts, or what you think is likely. Is it a big gimmick? Is it just fake news?
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I think in so many ways, and I think I'm lucky, in the sense I've been, I just kind of was close to politics, and so you kind of, it's so ugly to see how the sausage is made, but once you kind of understand, you can see the track it's on. But I don't know, there's some interesting and intriguing bits here still. Let me just rattle off a couple of quick takes in different aspects about the situation, right? I think that there's, politically, there's just the really common sense that, Trump's fucking crazy, and like this is just weird, or it's a smoke screen, or it's a manifestation of a syphilis riddled brain, and in response to those things, I might kind of elevate this, like, the kind of holographic prince, or the interference pattern, even just kind of appearing crazy. It allows Trump's followers to derive whatever meaning they prefer from the like mix of tea leaves going different directions in chaotic ways. It's something for people to talk about. Like, he, of course, wants to dominate the media, and this is inflammatory. It's a thing that gets people talking. He controls the mic. There's a bunch of particulars here that are just useful for his domestic political positioning. The other thing is, of course, related to that, it confounds the opposition to him, right? But okay, well, that's just a very simple read, I think oh, sorry, did you want to say, DB?
Oh yeah, so I thought about, I mean, I've been staying away from the news. George knows why. It's just it's like interference. Like the news for me right now, it's interference. I'm focusing on stuff like I guess I can call it my alchemy project.
Okay.
But if I were to try to imagine what Hugh would say about it, well, he said that the Greenland ice sheet, enough of that melts and the Earth will flip. So,
Yeah.
so the deep state, so to speak, Trump's puppet masters, like, to me, he's just a vacuous husk of a human with no interiority whatsoever, and he's just being puppeteered by people much more clever than he is. if Hugh is right and the United States government knows about the flippening, then they probably see a strategic advantage in controlling it. Maybe they think they can, what do you call it, slow the melt or speed it up, depending on how it benefits state power. I'm not
Yeah.
too sure, because trying to get in those people's heads is hard for me, because from my perspective, they're completely fucking insane. But yeah, so I'm pretty sure Hugh would go on some kind of tangent like that if I'm correct. If not, then yeah. I mean, what do you think, George?
Yeah, that's what I suspect. That's what I think.
And
But I
one
wonder
thing,
how he would frame it. I think he would go down that path. So I think you're right.
Yeah, he knows a lot more about that sort of stuff than I do. I just sort of have a cursory glance at history, but I don't know. It's really weird how my navigate daily is more based on I want to say intuition is probably a word for it, like emotion. So I'm not very what do you call it? I guess super intellectual about things, but I've had this kind of, so Hugh and Gary talked about this. They talked about the paraclete and how it like burns, when something is wrong and you should avoid a situation. So I've had that with me all my life. That's probably the reason why I'm here right now. How I was able to see through all the lies of the culture, was immediately kind of allergic to Christianity as my family tried to inculcate me with that, and I was resistant to it because, the idea of humans reigning supreme over everything and treating other forms of life as frivolous things to just do with what they want, that always struck a wrong, just a really dour chord with me. And so yeah, so looking at history, like even as they try to uh in schools, for instance, when they teach about American expansion, I was like already on the side of the, American Indians. I'm like, are we the baddies moment? Yeah, already when I was like 11. So, yeah, I kind of just decided to call that intuitive side of myself antimony, the antimony from alchemy,
Right.
because it dissolves all other metals but the gold. So, yeah, Hugh talked about that. I'm like, yeah, that really resonates with me. That's probably what's going on and what's guided me all this time.
Well, antimony was also known as the wolf of the metals.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I've seen her in dreams. I was calling her the multiform beast before when I was like a teenager. And then I painted her as a wolf in high school, like I said before, like when I was looking in the mirror and I painted her as a black wolf with fiery amber eyes between, two trees in a really dark forest. I wish I have that painting still. I lost it when I was homeless. Um, yeah, so it's really interesting. I'm like always hesitant to talk about these things because it feels like blasphemy in a way. Yeah.
a few things, regarding the flippening, I think just beyond the ice sheet, I have an impression from a gravity map that I saw of the planet at one point that, maybe beyond just the weight of the ice, that Greenland may be a kind of an anomalous area for its gravity, the density there. And this makes me wonder if, as the pole is kind of moving in that direction right now, if that means that Greenland will end up somewhere near the equator in the flippening or come back to the pole, in the flippening. I don't really know the dynamics of that, but I think that's really interesting from the flippening perspective. But then there's all these geopolitical situations kind of relevant to to this too. Not just internal domestic politics, right? But like, okay, I think we've probably all heard of the Manchurian Candidate hypothesis, right? There's movies about it or whatever, So one of the, and I'm not saying anything, I'm not saying it is or is not any way, but one thing that's really interesting about the Manchurian candidate, kind of hypothesis is then, okay, well, if the Manchurian candidate was elected, then how would they behave particularly that would indicate, anything that we might derive from? And one of the really interesting, and I forget where I encountered this, one of the really interesting, tactics that Russia would use to disrupt the West in this kind of, foot race for, what they do, foot race for resources, is to have the United States pick on Greenland. And the reason for this is that Greenland is NATO defended, but it's a weak point. Greenland isn't its own nation, it's a protectorate of Denmark. So it's under the protection of NATO, but not directly as a member, And so, if the Manchurian candidate thing were true and, in the White House is somebody working to disrupt all of Europe and NATO, then one of the first things they would do, beyond, defunding NATO and picking on all the allies, one of the first things they would do is start to make grabs at the weak points, like Greenland. And, there's things about like ducks and how they sound and if it quacks like a duck and whatever, I don't know. But then the other thing is that, it's been my belief, just generally, that the strategy leading up to the Ukraine, the geopolitical strategy is, of course, we're going to go ahead and allow, global warming and whatever else just to go ahead and occur. And what is at stake is a massive race for the energy resources, right? And there's some modest energy resources in Greenland, but under the Arctic ice is, substantial energy resources. And there's already for a couple decades been this jockeying fight for who can establish control over Arctic energy. And Greenland is just a massively important location for bases for local control of Arctic energy resources, either for Russia or for the West, depending on who will end up controlling it. So beyond the Manchurian candidate situation, there's also this situation. And I think that was partially kind of induced by the idea that it's my sense that the Western military establishment was trying to kind of keep Russia as a piñata for them. Like as global warming kind of continued to attack, we could beat up Russia and keep them small and keep them out of energy resources and maybe even raid their energy resources by market action or military action. And the war in Ukraine is a reaction to that strategy. I think Putin knows he was being put in a box and went to hybrid warfare, taking to our social media to counteract it. The only domain where the asymmetrical warfare could, maybe help them out of the box,
Yeah, there's actually, all of that could be simultaneously true. Like, because Hugh always talked about how the cults, in the system nest into each other. So there's probably different layers of motivation, but they're all kind of aligned. So like the geostrategic guys are pursuing the resources, but maybe the guys in the deepest recesses of the state that know like the flippening and all this stuff is just riding the tides, waiting for their moment to jump ship. As all this is going on, they're just kind of staring it lightly. Because, maybe another aspect to this too is maybe like the governments like, what is it, United States government and Russia maybe ran the simulations, like Hugh talked about the supercomputer, and maybe identified Greenland as one of the, what do you call it, it's one of those 3 axes points that you can sit on during the flippening to survive it. And since these psychopaths are all about survival, they literally think that the point of living organisms is to survive, which makes no sense because we all individually die. like that worldview never made any sense to me. But Yeah.
Well, the
So,
alien cortex, seeks its immortality through the propagation of this pattern, right?
yeah.
So,
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So it's always about finding a stone and carving their name into it. But it's like stones a road. You can't be immortal.
yeah, no, you have a great point. None of these explanations are exclusive. They all synergize.
They can. Yeah. They can synergize. So it's possible that they're all true at the same time. And actually, often that is the case for a lot of complex things. Is
That's how
multiple,
reality manifests. Yeah.
yeah, multiple things are true at once. Um, yeah, so it's crazy, and as we can see, the world is going even crazier. Like, the UFO cult is emerging, the left wing, right wing cult is emerging, and it looks like it literally looks like the apocalypse. So it's all these cults, and it's like, he talked about how to survive this. Is like, you got to avoid being trampled by these things. Like, don't go on the alien ship. Um, don't be rigid in an ideology, because he said the alien cortex doesn't survive this, because it's a quantity surveyor. That's all it does. And maybe the act of that quantity surveying is what got humans kicked out of Eden to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like you, for sure. And I agree, It's
Yeah, I don't like me personally. I don't think like that at all. I don't quantity survey at all. I don't. It just I don't. Maybe I did in like my teenage years to an extent, but I kicked the habit in my early 20s. In my early 20s, when I kind of had a mental breakdown. But yeah, I just don't think that way. It's like, I remember doing it, and it just made the world miserable. Like, it made me think of all the those sages talking about the suffering of the world, and a lot of them, like a lot of these online guys, like Martin Butler and stuff, tend to pin the idea of the suffering of the world on the animal nature. But it's like, I don't see that. I look out and I don't see the animals suffering. I see ravens every day, and they seem to be having fun playing with the wolves. So I just don't get it. It doesn't seem to me that this horrible red and tooth and claw suffering is the whole story. I think that is created by the mind, actually.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it doesn't seem to acknowledge the dissonance that, at least to me, seems to be behind the suffering. It doesn't seem to acknowledge how being in accord with your instincts and environment creates joy, which is also my experience. So yeah, agreed.
Cornfed, do you personally think that geothermal energy in Greenland could be a long-term game plan? Or do you think it's a fool's errand?
You know, I don't have a lot of hope for. Okay, so what would be the system that would develop geothermal energy from Greenland? Now, geothermal energy is really interesting. I think deep earth geothermal is really the most promising potential, but that's a different subject than what you asked, of course. So we talk about Greenland geothermal, right? So you need transmission somehow. Probably what they would do is just overproduce geothermal in Greenland to an absurd degree, right? Turn it into hydrogen and ship hydrogen everywhere. That's probably the most likely scenario, you know? And to me, powering the world on hydrogen from Greenland, I mean, this is actually novel. I haven't encountered this before, so thanks for bringing it up. Yeah, that's feasible, but the supply lines, it's complicated. So there's a dirty reality to the energy system, of course, which maybe you're already aware of, hence your question. But it's more about control and centralization. Like the reaction to clean energy is it's decentralized, liberal enabling of reality, right? So the system wants energy generated in a single place that it can build a fortress around, and then wants people to be dependent on shipments from that place. And there you see our entire energy model today, right? Now, geothermal out of Greenland, yeah, fits that model. You'd have to overproduce by about 3 or 4 times to serve the rest of the world with enough hydrogen to then power their economy, or, however else you might convert that, like, yeah, I guess you could ship around like iron rust batteries or something. That's pretty heavy, that's for sure. Now, I'd really, if this is going to convert into some kind of sustainable thing, the best bet I would have is on deep earth geothermal. But the problem for the system with deep earth geothermal is if you can get the deep earth borehole, you can produce geothermal, superheated, supercritical water coming out of anywhere on the planet. And so then you don't need, there's no reason that you can force them on to, being dependent upon you. So, yeah, I mean, the game plan could be tons of geothermal from Greenland and then a police state for the rest of the world. That's certainly feasible.
Right. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for delving into that. It's worth knowing about.
Yeah, that's an interesting possibility if they're trying to dominate Greenland. And then, I'm still kind of curious about how they would consider the shipping routes and all that. But if you could imagine, that would probably pretty capably serve Europe and Canada and North America generally. Yeah, we'd have, it's going to take 50 years to develop, though. Also interesting. There's a bunch of wrinkles there.
Yeah. What do you mean exactly?
Well, okay, so that would be if the world slides towards, continues this control-oriented approach, right? So inherent in that is the military force to subjugate the rest of the planet so they can't develop their own energy sources, right? Against the backdrop of a collapsing oil system, while still maintaining the shipping that could deliver that energy. But the fact is, this is technologically feasible right now. So that's a major advantage for it, The amount of time it would take to scale it up and the instability and military dominion needed to create during that time frame. I mean, that's really rolling the dice, but what isn't, Because on the other hand, deep earth geothermal is still also rolling the dice on whether or not we can consistently make these boreholes deep enough,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's certainly feasible. It's a pretty dark picture, of course, pretty dark future, like most were weighing. So,
do you think that global warming is a broader framework for understanding the Cold War? Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, is there a secret dimension to it?
Well, I see all this as kind of at the tail of the dog of oil energy. And so I would couch, the world wars and geopolitics rooted in this energy story. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor after we cut off their oil supply from the Philippines, and they had no other major oil source, right? Like, this energy supply underpins all geopolitics, all modern history. And, that I think is the, it's the kind of unifying secret, right? So then, of course, like global warming is, it's kind of in the picture, but it's also kind of negligible because the world is ruled by energy. That's the dictator from which everything else is governed, right? In this kind of geopolitical, economic sense.
Right.
So I don't know if that really disagrees with what you're saying, but
No, not at all.
The strategy, from Reagan, of course, and even earlier, is, damn the torpedoes. We're going to burn all the oil. We're going to burn it as fast as possible, even just only to deprive the USSR of it.
Oh yeah, that's that the spite of the alien cortex that Hugh warned everybody about. How if it's going down, it'll try to kill everything within its boundaries.
Anything it can reach, yeah.
Yeah, I recently came up with another kind of name for the alien cortex. Well, I didn't come up with it. It sort of just emerged while I was painting one day. Uh, the term objectifying intellect.
And do you mean that the intellect that makes objects of everything? Or even
Yes, but it's
intellects into objects?
I think both. So objectifying, so exteriorizing everything. So in a way, civilization. Darren and George have been talking about this. How a lot of it is the exteriorization and fossilization of all these capacities. So in a way, that's what this thing is doing.
Right. Yep.
You can see it. How Hugh talked about civilization is basically the left brain spilling all over the planet with its square structures. So it's just another kind of term. I'm not suggesting it should supersede anything.
Yeah, it's great though. I really do love the the hallmark of the alien cortex, the square, the straight line. It's very revealing. Well, I don't know if anyone has anything on the tip of their tongue, but I should probably run. I got another call here in an hour and a half. But really enjoyed our chance to connect today.
Yeah, me too, as always. Yeah, it's always great to talk to you and hang out. Yeah, so I'm sure I'll see you soon.
Sounds great. And DB, enjoy the Wolves. That sounds like fun.
I think he actually just dropped out for some reason.
I see.